My name is Mike Appledorf. I work with Kathy in the Education Outreach at the Library of Congress. We are thrilled to welcome you to the second annual online conference for educators. Our session today, Beyond the Bubble, a new generation of historical thinking assessments, will be recorded, as Kathy says. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our presenter. Joel Breakstone co-directs the Teaching with Primary Sources program at Stanford University and directs the Stanford History Education Group. Along with Mark Smith and Sam Weinberg, he led the development of the group's assessment website, Beyond the Bubble. He received his PhD from Stanford Graduate School of Education. Before coming to Stanford, he taught high school history in Vermont. Welcome, Joel, and take it away.
Thanks, Michael. Really appreciate it. Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be joining you here virtually. I'm looking forward to this session, and what I hope to do during the course of this session is to introduce you to the materials that we've made available on Beyond the Bubble, and also to talk about how you might use them in your classrooms. My background is I was a high school history teacher in Thetford, Vermont before I began work at Stanford. And when I was a history teacher in Vermont, I had a lot of questions about how best to have my students engage in historical inquiry. How could I have them understand that history wasn't a single narrative, but it was a series of competing accounts, and that students needed to wrestle with different pieces of evidence and try to make sense of what happened in the past. But I often found that was really hard to do. My students weren't always ready to read historical texts, and it was often challenging for me as a teacher to locate those materials. And those questions were ultimately what led me to go to graduate school at Stanford and to work with people at the Stanford History Education Group. And when I was arriving at the Stanford History Education Group, the group had just released a new curriculum called the Reading Like a Historian curriculum. This is a screen capture of our old sheg.stanford.edu website. In the bottom right-hand corner, you can see the link to a curriculum. And so in the fall of 2009, we released the Reading Like a Historian curriculum, which at that time was composed of 75 U.S. history lessons, which focused on having students engage in historical inquiry, to ask them to read like a historian, to use the same historical thinking skills that historians use when they engage with historical texts, to have students consider the source of the documents, who wrote it, when, why, and for what purpose, and to think about the context in which documents were created, and to corroborate across multiple documents, and to look for points of similarity and disagreement, and to read closely, to look at what were the words that the author chose to use, and what words were left out, and what content was left out. And the curriculum proved to be popular, and we got a lot of emails. The most frequent request was, or question was, where are the world history materials? Since then, we have worked to address that shortcoming and now have world history materials as well. But the second most frequent question was, where are the assessments? If I'm going to emphasize these historical thinking skills in my classroom, if I'm going to ask my students to source documents and to corroborate documents and to place them into context, how do I know whether or not they can actually do that? And we didn't have a really good answer for those emailers. And at the same time, there was a much broader conversation going on about a need for new types of assessments. In 2009, President Barack Obama said, "I'm calling on our nation's governors and state education chiefs to develop standards and assessments that don't simply measure whether students can fill in a bubble on a test, but whether they possess 21st century skills like problem solving and critical thinking." And he said that, and we said, yes, we absolutely agree. Where are those assessments, especially if you are a social studies teacher? Where do you find these types of assessments? And we didn't have a clear answer. What we were interested in doing, though, was to create new types of formative assessments in particular. We thought that there was a need for new types of assessments moving beyond multiple choice questions, and also types of assessments that teachers could use for formative assessments. And what I'd like to do is just take a moment to talk briefly about what your thoughts are about formative assessment. So when you hear the term formative assessment, what comes to mind? Yeah, so seeing some of these initial responses, so the notion of having quick, informal checks on student understanding is certainly a big piece of formative assessment. In-process assessment, so trying to gauge student learning along the way. during the course of instruction or unit, the types of assessments you want to do in preparation for a summative assessment. And I think that comment is also really important about that ultimately formative assessment is used to inform our instruction as teachers, that we can gather data from formative assessments to shape what we do next as teachers, and to inform students about what they need to do better, right? If we have a clear goal set out, how do we help students to understand what they need to do to ensure that they can meet that end product goal? And there is an enormous amount of material out there talking about formative assessment. If you go onto Amazon, you can find no shortage of books and instructional guides about making formative assessment happen in your classrooms. But if you're a history social studies teacher, there aren't a lot of materials that are providing actual assessments to use formatively. And that's what struck us. And we weren't the only ones who were struck by the lack of strong formative assessment materials. Former Secretary of Education Arne Duncan wrote, not enough is being done to use high quality formative assessments to inform instruction in the classroom on a daily basis. Too often teachers have been on their own to pull these tools together. And we've seen in the data that the quality of formative tools has been all over the place. So we were interested in creating assessments that focused on historical thinking skills, and it could be used for formative purposes. So we wanted to make historical thinking assessments, and we wanted to make materials that could be used formatively. At the same time, we joined the Library of Congress's Teaching with Primary Sources Consortium, and so we knew that we wanted the materials that would be the basis for these assessments to be drawn from the world's largest library, the Library of Congress. But what we wanted to do was to have an idea of what were the assessments that were already available to history social studies teachers. And we really saw them as existing on a continuum of complexity. At one end of the spectrum are multiple choice questions, which are easy to give and easy to score, but they're not the best tool necessarily for measuring all of the types of ways of thinking we'd want our students to be able to do. So at the other end of the spectrum are document-based questions, which are really rich tasks that ask students to read a series of primary documents and to use them to construct an analytic essay in the course of usually about an hour. Their complexity, though, can also make them slightly imprecise. Sometimes it can be hard to know why a student has struggled on a DBQ. In addition, they're not the best tool for formative assessment because they take a while for students to complete and even more time for teachers to score. Similarly, multiple choice questions are not always the best formative tool because they don't give us a lot of feedback about student thinking. And so we wanted to try to fill this middle range of trying to make something more complex than a multiple choice question, but less time consuming than a DBQ, something that could be used more readily in a history classroom on a daily basis to give teachers feedback, as we described, that could inform instruction and could be used as a gauge of learning in process. And so rather than describing those in more detail, I'd like to show you one of the assessments that we have made. This is an assessment that focuses very specifically on the skill of sourcing, and particularly whether or not students will pay attention to the date of the document. So this image presents students with this painting, which the title of it is The First Thanksgiving, 1621. It is from 1932, and the author is the artist is J.L.G. Ferris. And the question is, this painting helps historians understand the relationship between the Wampanoag and the Pilgrim settlers in 1621. Do you agree or disagree? Briefly support your answer. What do you think would be some common student mistakes if they were given this assessment? What would be common student mistakes you think your students might make in responding to this assessment that focuses on the date of the document and whether or not students will attend to the dates? Yes, so these responses are right on target, pointing out what are some of the most common types of responses that we would see. A lot of students will repeat back content that they have learned previously and really focus more than anything on the content of the document rather than noticing the date at all. And so this is the most common student response we've seen. We have now piloted this with thousands of students, and this type of response is the most frequent one. The student wrote true, because you can see how they're interacting with each other. Without any picture, you couldn't really see how Wampanoag Indians and the Puritans interacted with each other. Essentially, a picture is worth 1,000 words. If you didn't have this picture, how could you know anything about what happened between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag? In addition, we see students who have a very different type of response. This student wrote, "As soon as the settlers arrived, there was mass curiosity, which turned into violence and hatred. There was never such a party between the two peoples. They couldn't even understand each other." So clearly this student has a more critical vision of American history and has a notion that there was conflict between the Native Americans and Europeans. But really, there are, in many ways, the two responses are very similar, because in both cases, the student has ignored a crucial detail, which is the date of the document, and has not acknowledged some of the limitations that exist with using a document that was created more than 3 centuries after the event that it depicts. At this point, sometimes people ask, well, why not just make a multiple choice question? What is the value added of having students write short responses as they complete one of these tasks? And what we think is that the short responses, even a couple of sentences, provide really useful information for us as teachers to inform our next steps in teaching, and gives us really good detailed information about student thinking. So for instance, this student, they rejected the source. So if this was a multiple choice question, the student would have gotten full credit because they have said it was not a useful source. But there are some issues in the reasoning. So the student wrote, "Painted by a white person from Europe, of course they will be extremely biased in order to bring to light a highly positive image of the Europeans as to excite more foreign expeditions, because the Indians look so friendly and thankful." So on the one hand, the student has made some assumptions, assuming that JLG Ferris must be a white person from Europe, and also appears not to have paid attention to the date of the document, given that they seem to think that in 1932 there were efforts to quote unquote excite more foreign expeditions. And so that's problematic. However, on the other hand, the student has done something really good, because they at least are paying attention to the fact that the author of a document, or artist of this document, influences the content of the document. So if this is my student, I can say, I'm really glad that you're thinking about the way in which the author influences the content of the document. However, we also need to think carefully about when the document was created. And we want to make sure that we don't jump to conclusions about authors of documents without more information. And so in that way, it really could serve a more formative purpose. We also see some really polished responses. This was a response actually written by an 8th grader. And she wrote, "This painting was drawn 311 years after the actual event happened. There's no evidence of historical accuracy, as we do not know if the artist did research before painting this, or if he just drew what is a stereotypical Pilgrim and Indian painting." This is a really nice response, because the student has done 2 things: both identified the limitations of the of using a document that's created 3 centuries later, but has also noted that if we knew more about what the artist had done in preparing to create this document, we might be better able to evaluate its usefulness as a historical source. What's striking is that it is written by an 8th grader, and it's something we've found over and over again, is that there is not a clear developmental trajectory for students' ability to engage in historical thinking. What we found, perhaps not surprisingly, is students who have been taught to engage in historical thinking are able to do so, and those who haven't don't engage in historical thinking as often. We've seen 5th graders who've constructed similar responses that as this one, not quite as polished in terms of the prose, but accurately identifies the issue associated with the date. In contrast, we've also worked with 12th graders who have taken AP US History who have not done quite as well, in part because that wasn't the focus of the class they were taking. But what students see is that what this shows us is that students need this type of direct instruction. This particular assessment focuses on sourcing. Other assessments focus on content knowledge. We have an assessment that is about the civil rights movement, and it asks students to look at 2 different documents and to reason about which came first. Others focus on contextualization, and others focus on corroboration. The assessments are all available on beyondthebubble.stanford.edu. In order to download PDFs of the assessments, you need to create a free login for the website. The same login works for Beyond the Bubble and also our other website, the Stanford History Education Group's main website, sheg.stanford.edu, to download Reading Like a Historian lesson plans. And you can do that on the lower half of the page. The assessments themselves are available in the tab that says Assessments, and when you click on that, you'll be taken to this page. The assessments are organized by type. So we have multiple versions of each assessment. So we have additional versions of the same Thanksgiving assessment where there is a gap in time between the document and the event that it depicts. And if you click onto the assessment, you're taken into the assessment page itself, where there is a description of the assessment. There is a link to Common Core standards that are addressed by the particular assessment for the social studies. And on the right-hand side, there is a navigation bar. There's also a link to the PDF of the document and also a link to where the document lives in the digital archives of the Library of Congress. For each of the assessments, there is a short 3-level rubric. 3 is proficient. Students have absolutely gotten the answer correct. 2 are emergent, is students have done something good, but it's not all the way there. Or 1, a basic, they have missed the boat and have engaged in a variety of common mistakes. And for each of those, we have links to sample student responses, the types of responses that we've seen most frequently when we have piloted those materials. And for those sample student responses, there are these little blue thumbtacks. And if you roll over those thumbtacks, there are short annotations about what we think is going on with that particular response. There is also a short streaming video that goes along with each of the main assessments that talk about what we think is going on with this particular assessment and or how you might use it in your classrooms. Which and then finally, there is also a section where you can leave comments, and you can also see what other teachers have said about these particular tasks. The question, though, is about classroom implementation, or what do I do with these things, these new tasks? How might I go about using them in my classroom? And so it's an excellent question, and it's something that we have spent time thinking about because there are a variety of ways in which it can be difficult to implement new types of assessments in classrooms. One issue that we've seen come up is that as teachers, we often rush to rubrics. That when we give an assessment to our students, we think that we need to give a grade to it, and we need to put a score into our grade book. And students often feel that as well. We spent a lot of time with teachers in San Francisco Unified School District that they began to use these materials, and students would ask if they didn't get a grade back. They'd say, well, what about that quiz yesterday? What was my grade on the quiz? And sometimes that gets in the way of what the tasks actually tell us about student thinking or the information we could use to inform our next steps as teachers. Similarly, they don't always align up with the curriculum demands of that we are working under, and these types of assessments that focus on more than just content, also historical thinking skills, aren't always perfectly aligned. And even if they are shorter than a DBQ, if you have 150 students in your course load, it still takes a substantial amount of time to grade one or two sentences from 150 students. And so we were looking for ways to use these materials in a range of contexts. And so here are a few things that we saw as we've worked with teachers, where teachers have integrated these materials in ways that we found particularly productive. So one is to introduce historical thinking. One teacher that we worked with gave students the Thanksgiving assessment at the very beginning of the school year. And she was pretty confident that students would ignore the date, and then she could use this as an introduction to the idea of sourcing. And so she gave this task in the first week of school, and as she expected, almost everybody missed the date entirely. Instead of collecting those assessments and grading them, she just had students hold on to them and asked students, how many of you noticed the date? Very few students had. And she then said, look, in this class, in this year, we are going to really pay attention to the dates of documents. We're going to pay attention to the source information of documents. And that's why it's important, because if you don't, you might think that a document created 300 years later was a really useful source. And that was an introduction to the idea of sourcing with those students, not a grade in any fashion, but it also gave her some immediate information about what her students were actually able to do. So there was an immediate feedback about their abilities to source documents. There's also the possibility that we can monitor student understanding, that we can get feedback on how well students are using these material, understanding these concepts. So for instance, the same teacher who used that Thanksgiving assessment during the first week of school followed it up with this assessment a couple of weeks later, and it is the same assessment, but it uses this alternative image of the signing of the Mayflower Compact from 1859, more than 230 years after the actual event, and it asks the same question. In this case, given that she had introduced the idea and had gone over the response with students at the beginning of the year, she then graded students' responses on this particular task, because she felt confident that at this point students should have gained that understanding. And so it was a way to monitor that their understanding of this topic going forward. And you are not limited by the assessments that we have on our website. Our hope is that the teachers will create their own versions of these assessments, and that really they are shells that you can fill in with other types of documents. The Thanksgiving assessment just requires a document where there's a gap in time between the event or the document and the event that it depicts. Some of our favorite Library of Congress websites to locate materials are the library's homepage, loc.gov. The teachers page, it has really an incredible array of materials as well that have been carefully curated for teachers. Really lovely document sets, lesson plans, really some of the best materials that are available on the library sites have been put together on the teachers page. And one of my favorite sites is chroniclingamerica.loc.gov, which has thousands of historic newspapers that are fully searchable by keyword and by date and by location. And so you can then download full PDFs of the newspaper page from that includes your search terms. A really fantastic resource to be able to show students a whole range of documents from all across the United States. For world history teachers, the World Digital Library is an incredible resource that is in partnership with cultural institutions all around the world with the Library of Congress, and it continues to expand rather rapidly. So really great resources from all across the world, and you can search by both time period and geographic location. And then a more recent addition is AmericanArchive.org, which is a partnership with WGBH in Boston, and it is an archive of public radio and television materials. broadcasts. So really some outstanding resources to locate there as well. And our hope is that teachers will be able to use the assessments we've created as a jumping off place and create new versions of these same types of assessments. And then the final way that we envision these materials being used is as a way to broach broader historical topics. And we saw teachers do that with another one of our assessments, which focuses on this image. How many people are familiar with this image? And or how many of you have a poster of this image in your classroom? Lots of people, right? A really iconic image from the Great Depression and from the Dust Bowl. This image, Migrant Mother, taken by Dorothea Lange in 1936. And we wanted students to think about the context in which the image was created, because often we forget that there is a photographer behind photographs. Often it becomes simply students see photographs as windows into the past rather than as a product of a particular person. And Dorothea Lange was employed by the federal government to build support for their programs. And we wanted students to think about this image in that context. And so we presented students with this image, the source information. The title's Migrant Mother, 1936, by Lange, and she took the photograph in Nipomo, California. And then we told students that the Resettlement Administration was one of FDR's agencies that helped people from the Dust Bowl. The agency hired photographer Dorothea Lange to take pictures that would build support for its programs. This photograph was one of several that Lange took of migrant farm worker Florence Thompson and some of her 7 children. Then we asked students a series of questions. First, why might the background information above lead you to question the photograph's reliability? 2, what is one feature of the photo that might lead you to question its reliability? Explain your reasoning. And 3, what is one thing that you'd want to know about Dorothea Lange or how she took this photo to better determine its reliability? This would help me determine the reliability of the photo because we provide students with a sentence starter. And so when we worked with teachers in San Francisco, they found some immediate patterns in terms of feedback from students based on their responses. Some student responses showed some fundamental misunderstandings in terms of historical knowledge. This student said that the Dust Bowl did not take place in California. The Dust Bowl was a Midwestern crisis that destroyed countless acres of land, and did not understand clearly that many migrants ended up in California as a result of the Dust Bowl. Other students put together more sophisticated responses. This student wrote, the photo was taken in order to gain support for agencies that help people in the Dust Bowl. This could mean that the photo is fake and only made so that you feel sorry and want to help. This is like propaganda. A really nice response, both indicating that there's a possibility that the photographer's motivation influenced the content of the photograph, but also tempering the response so as not to claim too much based on the evidence available. With the second question, we again see some slightly problematic responses. This student wrote, Florence Thompson shows her emotion in the photograph. She should have been happy about moving away from the Dust Bowl. Again, a little problematic in terms of misunderstanding the plight that faced many migrants once they arrived in California. Other students had more sophisticated responses. One feature of the photo that might lead me to question its reliability is the way her hand is posed on her face and the way her children are both hiding their faces. It looks posed and artificial. The photo doesn't look candid, like a candid, honest shot. Again, raising the possibility that there might have been a way in which Lange had posed the photograph. What was striking, though, in using the assessment in the classroom was that the teacher found many students were ready to simply reject the assessment. They did not want to consider possible limitations. They simply wanted to reject it entirely, which the teacher found slightly troubling. and wanted students to think a little more carefully about the way in which, even if Lange might have been paid to take this photograph, that it still provides useful evidence. And he complicated their vision of the photograph by providing outtakes from that from the same session. And so these are the additional images that Lange took of Florence Thompson and her family in Nipomo, California, and asked them whether or not, given this additional information, that would shift the way that students thought about the images. A couple of students were willing to say that this shifted their understanding. They were a little more willing to think of the migrant mother as a useful source, but many students stuck to their guns and said, "Nope, I think it's all staged," which the teacher was troubled by, and asked the students, "How many of you have ever posed for a photograph?" And when they were reluctant to raise their hands, he said, "Well, all of you took school photographs, so clearly you have posed for a photograph. Is that not a useful piece of evidence about you at a particular time and place, even if it is posed?" And as the conversation went on, the students and the teacher had engaged in a conversation about what makes a piece of evidence useful, and what makes a photograph useful or not in terms of historical evidence. And although I'm not sure that the teacher was aware of it, in the process, the teacher and the students had entered into a conversation that is a historical debate. A historian, James Curtis, has written about this image of Lange, and he has argued that Lange had indeed staged this photograph. In contrast, Errol Morris, the documentary filmmaker, has argued against it and has challenged this notion that indeed Lange had staged the photographs. And Errol Morris wrote, "Is the argument that Lange should not have intended to produce any effect? None whatsoever. Isn't the issue a deeper, far more problematic issue? Namely, did the photographer intend to deceive the viewer? Was he or she using photography as sleight of hand? Is the problem intentions? But if so, how could one do away with them altogether? We read correctly or incorrectly a photographer's intentions into every photograph we see. We also imagine the intentions of the people in a photograph. We see intentions everywhere." A very deep historical question being raised here, and in the process of this short assessment, the teacher had brought his students into this much larger frame of wondering about how to use photographs as evidence. So a different way of thinking about these assessments. They could also be used on a unit test or as a exit ticket at the end of class. Our hope is that they are flexible and that they could be used in a variety of contexts, and that as new types of assessments, students are going to need practice in using them and opportunities to understand what are these types of questions, what do they look like, and what our expectations are for the way that they are going to answer them. Please note down my contact information. We spend a great deal of our time sending materials out into the wilds of the web, and we love to hear how teachers are using these materials. And if you have any questions or comments about them, please feel free to reach out to us. If you're interested to know when new materials are going live on Beyond the Bubble, the best place to find out is on our Twitter or Facebook pages. Sorry, the @ symbol is blocked off there on the @Stanford. We don't send out emails, but we do post on Twitter and Facebook when we have new assessments go live. We have quite a few assessments that will be going online in the coming months. So if you want to know when those go on, check out those posts.